Alan Crier was the kind of man no one noticed. Quiet, pale, always watching. Emily Shore was the girl who vanished without a trace. For over a year, their names meant nothing to each other. Then, one night, in a town where nothing ever happened, their paths crossed, and a nightmare began. What no one knew was that beneath Alan's crumbling house, hidden from the world, was a secret chamber built for torment. By the time the truth surfaced, 2 women were dead, one barely alive, and the man behind it all had disappeared without a sound. How did he get away with it for so long? And who would be next? In the sleepy suburb of Elmridge, summer had always been a season of comfort. Children pedaled their bikes down sunlit sidewalks. Neighbors waved to one another across freshly cut lawns, and the local ice cream truck made its rounds like clockwork every afternoon. Birchwood Lane, in particular, had a reputation for being picture-perfect. Families had lived there for generations, and everyone seemed to know everyone else, at least on the surface. It was the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. That illusion shattered on the night of July 18, 2016. Jenna Milburn, a 23-year-old nursing student, vanished somewhere between her best friend's house and her parents' driveway, a walk that should have taken 7 minutes. She had left just before 10, texting her mother that she'd be home soon and asking her to leave the porch light on. But she never made it. When morning came and Jenna's bed remained untouched, her mother called the police. At first, officers treated the case like a possible runaway or a romantic dispute. Jenna had recently ended a relationship, and police suspected she might have gone off to clear her head, but her phone was discovered less than a mile away, smashed and soaked from a sprinkler system. Her sandals, worn and familiar, lay abandoned beneath a thick hedge. The ground showed signs of a struggle, but no blood. No witnesses. No surveillance cameras pointed in the right direction. There was nothing, except the growing fear that someone had taken her. As days turned into weeks, the story of Jenna's disappearance spread beyond Elmridge. Flyers were stapled to telephone poles and taped to the windows of every small business in town. Local news stations ran emotional interviews with her tearful parents. Volunteers gathered to search nearby parks, trails, and empty lots. The community, once so secure, now walked a little faster and locked their doors a little earlier. Still, no sign of Jenna. People started whispering. Some believed she had met someone online and left willingly. Others suggested she had been targeted by a stranger passing through. A few began to suspect something darker, that the danger wasn't out there, but much closer than anyone wanted to believe. Then, a year later, it happened again. Maya Rowan, 26 years old, worked as a part-time barista and spent her evenings jogging through the neighborhood. She had her route memorized, and friends described her as cautious. On August 14, 2017, Maya left her apartment for her usual evening run just before sunset. She never returned. Her earbuds were found near the edge of a wooded lot behind an elementary school. The cord had been snapped. There were drag marks in the dirt, but no footprints, no tire tracks. Just the growing sense of a pattern. 2 disappearances, 2 women, 1 square mile. Residents started installing security systems. Parents stopped letting their kids walk to school. Local police increased patrols, but they were just as lost as the families left behind. With no leads and no bodies, the case went cold. Again. And then, in 2018, a 3rd woman vanished. Her name was Kira Bell. She was 22, worked at a local hardware store, and lived with her older sister on Oak Ridge Drive, just 4 streets over from Birchwood Lane. Kira left for a late shift one evening and was never seen again. Her car remained in the driveway. Her uniform hung on the bedroom door, untouched. Her purse and keys were missing. That time, there wasn't even a trail to follow. By now, the panic was no longer quiet. People were afraid to leave their homes. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed the area was cursed. Others insisted it was the work of someone they all knew, someone hiding in plain sight. Police brought in FBI profilers. They mapped the disappearances and searched for connections. But the only common thread was the geography. Each woman lived or worked within walking distance of one particular street, Birchwood Lane, a street that still looked like something from a postcard. A street with perfectly trimmed hedges, a street with a secret buried just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The house sat at the far end of Birchwood Lane, shaded by a crooked oak tree that hadn't been trimmed in years. Its paint had long since faded to a dull gray, the shutters hung at uneven angles, and the lawn was more weeds than grass. No one ever saw anyone mowing it. Packages were never left on the porch. The mailbox always seemed empty. It was the kind of place people passed without thinking, the kind that disappeared into the background of daily life. It belonged to Alan Crier. Not much was known about him. He kept to himself. He didn't attend neighborhood block parties or holiday potlucks. He didn't even open the door on Halloween. Most neighbors assumed he worked nights or had some kind of disability that kept him indoors. A few said he'd inherited the home from his parents and had never bothered to update it. Everyone agreed on one thing, though. Alan was odd, but not dangerous. That assumption proved to be a mistake. After the third woman disappeared, law enforcement began to take a broader approach. They returned to Birchwood Lane with clipboards and questions. They knocked on every door. Alan answered his in silence for several long seconds, before finally cracking it open just wide enough to show one pale, sunken eye. His face looked like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. He spoke slowly, said he didn't know anything, and added that he worked online and rarely left the house. His answers were vague, but not incriminating. There was no warrant, no cause to search. So they moved on. What they couldn't see was that Alan Crier had prepared for this exact moment. Beneath the warped floorboards in his living room, hidden under a throw rug and a layer of nailed-down plywood, was a square opening, just big enough to squeeze through. It led to a narrow crawl space, and beneath that, a hand-dug chamber reinforced with plywood walls, soundproof foam, and layers of thick insulation. A single bulb hung from a wire strung through the beams above. A small mattress sat in the corner. There were ropes nailed to the studs, restraints fashioned from zip ties, and a plastic bucket in place of a toilet. Alan had created his own underground prison. Neighbors had no idea. They never heard screams. They never saw anyone enter or leave. And Alan? He had learned how to be invisible. He ran errands only at night, paid for everything in cash, and kept his online activity untraceable. He'd stockpiled enough supplies to remain in isolation for weeks if needed. The women he captured were held in this space, stripped of light, time, and hope. He kept them alive just long enough to break them. Then he made them disappear. As fear tightened its grip on the town, suspicions grew. Some residents started compiling their own lists of possible suspects. Alan's name appeared more than once, but always with a question mark. He was strange, sure, but there was no evidence. He didn't fit the image of a monster. He wasn't charming or manipulative. He was forgettable. Just another shut-in in an aging home. But predators often hide in the places people least expected. Police surveillance ramped up. Officers patrolled the neighborhood in unmarked cars. They watched homes with binoculars, tracked known sex offenders, and consulted behavioral experts. But the case remained frustratingly cold. Then, in early 2019, a local utility company received a report of a gas leak on Birchwood Lane. It was a minor complaint, routine maintenance, nothing urgent. A technician arrived, scanned the homes for irregularities, and nearly skipped Alan Crier's irregularities. But something drew him to the gray house at the corner. Maybe it was the lifeless appearance, maybe just a gut feeling. When he ran his thermal scanner along the side of the house, he noticed something strange. There was a patch of heat coming from beneath the foundation. Not a pipe, not a boiler, something small and sustained. It didn't make sense. He flagged the anomaly and filed the report. What seemed like a minor technical note would soon become the unraveling of everything. Behind that strange heat signature was something no one could have guessed. Someone was still alive down there, and the secret Alan Crier had buried for years was about to be unearthed. The gas company's report was passed to the city's maintenance division, where it might have sat unnoticed for weeks, if not for a single clerk's curiosity. She reviewed the technician's findings and was puzzled by the thermal reading. A localized heat source underneath a private home with no basement, no furnace, and no registered renovations? It didn't fit the usual patterns. Out of protocol, and perhaps instinct, she forwarded the report to the police department's Special Investigations Unit, where it caught the attention of Detective Reed Halston, a man who'd spent the last 3 years trying to solve the Birchwood disappearances. Reed wasn't the type to chase false leads, but the heat signature nagged at him. It didn't make sense, unless someone was hiding something. He and a small team returned to Birchwood Lane with an unmarked van and a quiet urgency, no sirens, no uniforms. They parked at the end of the street and waited until the middle of the night, when the neighborhood had gone still. They knocked on Alan Crier's door. No answer. They knocked again. Silence. Inside, the lights were off, the curtains drawn. Nothing moved. When they returned the next morning with a warrant, Alan was gone. The house reeked of mildew and dust. Rooms were nearly empty, save for a few old chairs, piles of yellowed newspapers, and a small desk with an outdated laptop. The walls were bare. The kitchen was clean, but unused. There were no photos, no dishes, no signs of a normal life. But then they reached the living room. An officer stepped on the rug and felt something shift beneath the floor. They peeled it back to find fresh plywood, cut precisely to match the floorboards around it. It was nailed down carefully, but not carefully enough. Within an hour, they had removed the panel and uncovered a wooden hatch. It was small, uncomfortably small. They opened it and felt warm air rising from below. The space beneath was dark and smelled of sweat, plastic, and something else. Something rotting. As their flashlights cut through the shadows, they saw a makeshift ladder leading down into what appeared to be a pit. Dirt walls surrounded the chamber. At first it looked empty. Then from the far corner came a sound, a cough. Weak, barely audible. They called for medics. The woman they found was pale and trembling, her eyes wide with terror even as she tried to focus on the lights above. She was covered in bruises, her wrists scarred by restraints. She could barely speak. But she was alive. Her name was Emily Shore, the second woman who had vanished over a year earlier. The news shattered the town of Elmridge. Emily had been presumed dead. Her family had mourned her, buried an empty casket, and tried to move on. But now she was here, a living witness to horrors that none of them could imagine. As she was taken to the hospital, officers began a full search of the home and its surrounding property. What they uncovered next confirmed everyone's worst fears. In the crawlspace adjacent to the underground room, they found 2 duffel bags, each filled with women's clothing, phones, and personal items, tokens from other victims. In a hidden compartment beneath the floor, wrapped in tarp and duct tape, they found bones. Forensic teams later confirmed them to be the remains of Jenna Milburn and Maya Rowanall. 3 missing women had passed through this house. 2 had never left. The pit wasn't just a hiding place, it was a cage, a chamber of torment carefully crafted to conceal suffering. Alan Crier had built it himself, patiently, methodically, right under the noses of a quiet neighborhood. And now, the monster who had lived in silence was on the run. But he had left behind everything he tried to bury: his victims, his secrets, his name, and justice was already on his trail. Emily Shore's recovery was slow and painful. She had lost over 30 pounds during her captivity, and her skin bore the marks of prolonged restraint. But it was her mind that carried the heaviest burden. Hospital staff kept her under close supervision, both for her safety and to document anything she could remember. She didn't sleep for the first 2 nights. She flinched at every sound. Yet beneath the fear was something stronger. An urgent need to tell her story. Her memories came in fragments, broken and jumbled, but each piece added to the portrait of a man who had operated in darkness for far too long. She remembered being taken from behind during her nightly jog. How chemical, almost sweet, flooded her nose before everything went black. When she woke up, she was in the pit. No light, no windows, just dirt walls and a faint humming from the single bulb above. Alan never spoke much. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply observed. For hours, sometimes days, he would sit in a chair just above the hatch and watch. He wrote in a notebook constantly. When he did speak, it was to ask questions, bizarre, clinical questions about pain, loneliness, and fear. He treated her like a project, not a person. Every meal, every punishment, every moment of isolation had been calculated. Emily said he believed he was conducting some kind of study, as though their suffering had a purpose known only to him. She described the sounds of others, cries in the night, coughing, and eventually, silence. Alan had not kept all 3 women alive at the same time. One by one they had disappeared, and when they were gone, he burned their clothes, buried their bones, and started again. Investigators used her testimony to connect previously unexplained reports. A neighbor once reported a faint odor of something burning late at night. Another had called animal control about strange howling coming from the trees, each dismissed as unrelated. Now, they were pieces of a larger, far more sinister puzzle. The journal recovered from Alan's desk painted a terrifying picture. Every entry was methodical, labeled with dates and times, often with entries as short as a single sentence. Day 3, still not speaking. Day 11, finally screamed. Day 29, stopped eating, removed food for 48 hours. There were pages written in code, symbols and numbers that analysts were still trying to decipher, but the clearest entries were the ones that listed names. Essenate, Emily. He had written about each of them in the cold language of an experimenter. He documented when they cried, when they resisted, when they broke. He seemed fascinated by their patterns of defiance and despair, almost like a scientist cataloging the behavior of trapped animals. The journal also revealed something more chilling. Plans. There were sketches of new layouts for a second chamber, notes about improving ventilation, lists of materials needed for construction. He had been preparing for more. Emily hadn't just been his last victim. She had been the beginning of a new phase. And then, the final clue. A map, tucked into the last pages of the journal, was a rough drawing of a rural area just outside the city, marked with arrows and circles. It wasn't labeled, but it matched the description of a small cluster of abandoned farmhouses, miles from Elmridge. Alan had circled one in red and written the words Stage 2. Authorities raced to the location, but it was already too late. The farmhouse was empty. Inside they found signs that someone had been there recently. An empty water jug, a sleeping bag, a fire pit still warm. But no Alan. He was gone again. But the search was now a manhunt. Every news outlet in the state carried his face. Billboards showed his eyes, dark and lifeless, staring out at drivers on highways. Tips flooded in, most false, but investigators followed every single one. Because now they knew exactly who they were hunting and what he was capable of. Alan Crier had disappeared into the wind, but this time the world was watching, and his time was running out. The nationwide manhunt for Alan Crier escalated with each passing day. His face was everywhere, on television screens, digital billboards, even the front page of newspapers in cities hundreds of miles away from Elmridge. He had become a ghost who once lived in plain sight, and now every whisper in a dark alley, every abandoned barn, every stranger who didn't meet the right gaze drew suspicion. People were terrified, not only because of what he had done, but because they couldn't understand how he had escaped. Despite Emily Shore's detailed account and the discovery of his journal, Alan had left no digital trail behind. No social media, no phone records, no credit cards. He hadn't driven a registered vehicle, and his name wasn't attached to any recent purchases or travel logs. He was a phantom, one who knew how to vanish. Then, in the third week of the manhunt, a break came from an unlikely place. A wildlife photographer had been hiking through a remote stretch of forest land near the state border when he spotted an odd glimmer of metal in the distance. Curious, he followed the shape through thickets of brush until he came upon what looked like an abandoned storm shelter. The door was half covered by dirt and branches, its hinges rusted but not locked. Inside, it smelled of kerosene and damp soil. There were blankets, empty food cans, and a small burner stove. A tarp hung in one corner, covering something bulky. The photographer took pictures and called the authorities, his voice shaking as he described what he'd found. When police arrived, they discovered that the shelter had been used recently and extensively. Under the tarp were more notebooks. The handwriting matched the journal from Alan's house, and in one of them there was a new name. It wasn't a victim. It was someone still alive. Someone Alan referred to as the witness. Investigators didn't understand it at first. Emily had already been rescued. Jenna and Maya were dead. No other woman had been reported missing from Elmridge. So, who was the witness? Was it someone he'd abducted after fleeing, or had there been someone else all along? The answer came in the form of a blood-stained shirt, buried in a plastic bag beneath the shelter floor. Forensic testing identified it as belonging to a girl named Rachel Cobb, a 17-year-old who had gone missing from a neighboring county just 2 weeks prior. Her disappearance hadn't been connected to the Birchwood cases. Until now, this changed everything. Alan hadn't just vanished, he had already taken someone new. That discovery ignited a full-scale ground operation. Drones were deployed over nearby forests, and bloodhounds were brought in to sweep the area. The search grid expanded. Volunteers combed through fields, streams, and old hunting cabins. Time was running out, and everyone knew it. If Rachel was alive, she wouldn't be for long. Then, on the 9th day of the search, a team found a second bunker hidden beneath the ruins of a collapsed barn. The entrance was barely noticeable beneath a pile of leaves and debris. Inside they found her. Rachel was bound, weak, and dehydrated, but she was alive. After time, Alan had left in a hurry. Food was still cooking on the stove. The journal entries ended abruptly. Outside, they found a trail of fresh boot prints leading into the woods, but the rain had already started, and the tracks vanished within hours. Once again, he had slipped away. But this time, something was different. Inside the bunker, hidden behind a false wall, they found something Alan hadn't meant to leave behind. A photo of himself, younger, smiling with an older man. On the back, a name, David Crier, and an address scratched in faded ink. It led authorities to an estranged uncle in a coastal town nearly 300 miles away. Surveillance was placed immediately, and, sure enough, a man matching Alan's description was spotted walking along a beach trail just before sunset. He was arrested without incident, his clothes soaked, his eyes empty. He said nothing. After years of horror, the predator had finally been caught. The trials were long and gruesome, the testimonies were painful, but each victim's story was heard, and the truth was laid bare. Alan Crier was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. He would never see freedom again. Justice, slow and scarred, had finally come, and Birchwood Lane, once a place of quiet charm, would never be the same.